The easiest prison to escape is the one whose door was never locked. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, staring at a wedding dress that did not feel like it belonged to me. Layers of white satin reflected the warm chandelier above while soft piano music drifted through the walls of the old estate. Every detail looked beautiful. Fresh ivory roses rested beside the window. Crystal candles flickered across polished oak furniture. The afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the hardwood floor. Anyone looking through the window would have believed this was the happiest day of my life. They would have been completely wrong. My name is Olivia Brooks, and less than 1 hour before the ceremony, I had already decided to leave. The invitation had called it a wedding. The newspapers had called it the social event of the year. Every headline focused on the mysterious businessman Nathan Sullivan and the woman he was about to marry. They guessed it was about money. They guessed it was about power. None of them knew the truth. I barely knew it myself. I slipped off my wedding shoes and quietly crossed the room, careful not to let the wooden floor creak beneath my feet. My heartbeat echoed louder than the music downstairs. The bridal suite sat on the second floor of the historic mansion overlooking a quiet lake just outside the city. Through the tall windows I could see black luxury cars arriving one after another, each stopping beside the circular stone driveway before guests disappeared inside. Everything moved with quiet precision. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt chaotic. Somehow that perfect order made me even more nervous. I reached for the polished brass doorknob and paused. Everyone expected me to walk down the grand staircase wearing the dress. No one expected me to disappear through the side entrance instead. I slowly opened the closet, searching for the small backpack I had hidden behind several garment bags earlier that morning. Inside were ordinary blue jeans, a cream sweater, comfortable sneakers, my driver's license, a small amount of cash, and the only photograph I still carried of my late parents. It was enough. I did not need anything else. I carefully zipped the backpack closed and took one final look around the room. The flowers. The dress. The carefully arranged veil. They belonged to someone else's future now. Mine waited somewhere beyond the gates of the estate. I wrapped my fingers around the doorknob and quietly turned it. The latch clicked. My breath caught in my throat. I expected an empty hallway. Instead, the door opened to reveal Nathan Sullivan standing alone outside. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without a wrinkle, yet nothing about his expression suggested anger or disappointment. His calm blue eyes met mine for only a moment before drifting toward the backpack resting against my leg. Neither of us spoke. The hallway remained silent except for the distant sound of a string quartet preparing downstairs. I tightened my grip on the backpack, waiting for him to block the doorway or demand an explanation. He did neither. Instead, Nathan took one slow step backward, creating even more space between us. Then he looked directly at me and spoke in a voice so calm it almost startled me. "If you want to leave, Olivia, the door has always been yours to open." For several long seconds I simply stared at him, unable to understand what I had just heard. My fingers tightened around the strap of the backpack while the hallway remained perfectly still. Somewhere below us, glasses clinked softly as staff prepared the reception. The scent of fresh roses drifted through the open doorway, mixing with polished wood and the faint fragrance of expensive candles. None of it felt real anymore. I had spent weeks convincing myself that Nathan Sullivan would never allow me to leave. Yet there he stood, stepping farther away instead of closer. "You are not stopping me?" I finally asked. My voice sounded much smaller than I intended. Nathan slowly shook his head. "No." The answer came without hesitation. Without conditions. Without negotiation. I searched his face for anger, disappointment, or even relief. Instead, I found something far more confusing. Respect. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small leather envelope before placing it gently on the narrow table beside the hallway window. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished wood as he stepped back once again. "Inside," he said quietly, "you will find your passport, your driver's license, your phone, your bank cards, and the keys to the car waiting outside the east gate. I looked from the envelope back to him. You had all of those? He nodded once. They were placed in secure storage when you arrived yesterday. I wanted to make certain nothing was misplaced during the preparations. I slowly walked toward the table, never taking my eyes off him. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Everything was exactly where he said it would be. My identification. My wallet. Even the small silver bracelet that had belonged to my mother rested carefully inside a protective pouch. Nothing was missing. Why? I whispered. Nathan looked through the tall hallway windows toward the lake stretching behind the estate. The afternoon breeze gently moved the trees lining the shoreline, and sunlight shimmered across the calm water. Because if you stay today, he answered softly, I need to know it was your decision. His words unsettled me more than any command ever could have. I had prepared arguments. I had prepared excuses. I had even prepared myself to run. I had never prepared for freedom. The silence between us stretched comfortably instead of awkwardly. No guards appeared. No family members interrupted us. The mansion seemed almost to pause, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. I glanced toward the grand staircase leading downstairs. Through the railing I could see only a handful of guests quietly taking their seats inside the chapel. There were far fewer people than I had imagined. No flashing cameras. No reporters. No extravagant celebration. This is not the wedding I expected, I admitted. Nathan smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind his eyes. Neither is the reason for it. Before I could ask what he meant, an elderly woman approached from the opposite hallway carrying a small velvet ring box. She greeted Nathan with a warm smile before placing the box into his hands. Your grandfather asked me to give you this at exactly 2 o'clock, she said gently before walking away. Nathan looked down at the unopened box for several seconds, then quietly offered it to me instead. Before you decide whether to walk through the front door or the east gate, he said, there is something inside this box that you deserve to see first. The velvet ring box felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. I looked at Nathan, expecting him to explain what was inside, but he remained silent. His expression carried the same quiet patience that had unsettled me ever since I opened the bridal suite door. He was not asking me to trust him. He was waiting for me to discover the truth myself. I slowly lifted the lid. Instead of a diamond resting on soft velvet, I found a folded sheet of cream-colored stationery tucked beneath a simple platinum wedding band. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and the elegant handwriting across the front immediately caught my attention. It read, To the woman who will one day have the freedom to choose. My heartbeat slowed. Carefully unfolding the letter, I noticed the date written in the upper corner. It had been written almost 20 years earlier. The ink had faded, but every word remained beautifully clear. The letter did not begin with legal instructions or family expectations. It began with an apology. If you are reading this, then circumstances have brought you to a moment I always hoped would never arrive. No promise made between families should ever become a prison for the next generation. I looked up at Nathan in disbelief. He quietly nodded, encouraging me to continue. The hallway remained peaceful while distant music floated upward from the chapel below. I returned my attention to the letter. It explained that decades earlier, Nathan's grandfather and my father had built a charitable foundation together after surviving difficult financial years as young business partners. Their agreement protected scholarships, medical assistance programs, and several historic community properties that had helped thousands of families over the years. As the foundation grew, outside investors repeatedly attempted to dissolve it and divide its assets. To prevent that from ever happening, both families signed a legal succession agreement requiring descendants from each family to jointly oversee the foundation if certain future conditions were ever triggered. The agreement was never intended to force affection or ownership. It existed solely to preserve the mission they had started together. My hands trembled as I finished reading. Why did no one ever tell me this? I whispered. Nathan looked toward the chapel doors downstairs before answering. Your parents planned to explain everything when you were older. His voice softened. After they passed away, the documents were sealed by the Foundation's trustees until today. I lowered my eyes back to the platinum band resting inside the box. It looked remarkably simple, without oversized stones or elaborate decoration. Inside the ring, a short inscription had been engraved with careful precision. Choose freely. Always. Tears blurred my vision for the first time that afternoon. Every assumption I had made about this wedding slowly began to unravel. I had believed I was walking toward an obligation. Instead, someone decades earlier had quietly protected my right to refuse it. Then why hold the ceremony at all? I asked. Nathan took a slow breath before answering. Because today is the final legal deadline. If we both decline, the Foundation immediately transfers into the hands of a private investment group that has spent years waiting for this opportunity. I stared at him, struggling to process everything I had just learned. Before I could ask another question, the estate's grandfather clock echoed through the hallway, announcing the top of the hour. At that exact moment, the chapel doors below slowly opened, revealing not hundreds of guests, but only a handful of elderly trustees, family friends, and attorneys quietly waiting inside for one decision that would determine the future of something far greater than a wedding. The chapel remained perfectly quiet as Nathan and I slowly descended the grand staircase together. Neither of us reached for the other. We walked several feet apart, connected only by the unanswered questions that now filled my mind. Warm afternoon light poured through towering stained glass windows, covering the marble floor with soft shades of gold and blue. The chapel itself felt nothing like the extravagant ceremony I had imagined. Fewer than 20 people occupied the polished wooden pews. Most were elderly trustees, longtime family friends, and legal advisors who greeted us with quiet smiles instead of curious whispers. Fresh white lilies lined the aisle beside simple candles whose gentle flames barely moved in the still air. At the front of the room stood a long walnut table rather than a traditional wedding altar. Several leather-bound ledgers rested beside neatly organized legal folders, their pages marked with colored ribbons. It looked less like a wedding and more like the signing of an important promise. Nathan quietly pulled out a chair for me before taking his own seat across the table. No officiant hurried us forward. No music announced our arrival. Everyone seemed willing to wait until we understood exactly why we had gathered. An elderly attorney wearing silver-rimmed glasses slowly stood and opened the first ledger. His calm voice carried easily through the peaceful chapel. Before any decision is made today, both parties are entitled to review the complete history of the Sullivan Brooks Community Foundation. He carefully turned several pages until an old black and white photograph appeared. Two young men stood outside a modest brick building with rolled-up sleeves, laughing while painting a wooden sign that read Community Health Center. One was Nathan's grandfather. The other was my father, decades before I was born. My breath caught as I studied the familiar smile I had only seen in family albums. The attorney gently placed another photograph beside the first. This one showed volunteers serving hot meals after a devastating winter storm. Another displayed scholarship recipients standing proudly beside graduation banners. Every page revealed another chapter of lives quietly changed through the Foundation's work. Hospitals received equipment. Schools expanded scholarship programs. Historic buildings became community centers instead of commercial developments. None of it resembled the ruthless business empire people associated with Nathan's family name. For 40 years, the attorney continued, this foundation has remained independent because both founding families agreed that no single individual should ever control its future. He then placed the final document before us. Across the bottom rested two signature lines that remained blank. If these signatures are not completed before 5 o'clock today, ownership automatically transfers under a dormant legal clause established by previous creditors many years ago. I looked toward Nathan. You already knew all of this? He nodded quietly. Only recently. My grandfather waited until his final letter was released. I lowered my eyes toward the document again. Who receives everything if we walk away? Before Nathan could answer, the heavy chapel doors slowly opened. A sharply dressed businessman entered with two attorneys and offered a confident smile that never reached his eyes. He carried a polished leather briefcase and walked directly toward the front table as though he had been expected all along. The elderly trustees exchanged uneasy glances. The attorney beside us quietly closed the ledger before speaking in a measured voice. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Sullivan, allow me to introduce Mr. Richard Caldwell, the individual whose investment group stands to acquire every Foundation asset should today's agreement remain unsigned." Richard Caldwell carried himself with effortless confidence, as though the outcome had already been decided long before he entered the chapel. His charcoal overcoat rested neatly across one arm, and the polished leather briefcase in his hand reflected the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. He greeted several trustees with polite nods before stopping beside the walnut table. "Please forgive my late arrival," he said pleasantly. "Traffic from the city was slower than expected." His voice sounded courteous, yet something beneath the calm surface made every word feel carefully rehearsed. Nathan remained seated, his hands resting quietly on the closed ledger in front of him. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge the visitor. He simply watched. I realized then that true confidence rarely needed to become louder than the room itself. The elderly attorney adjusted his glasses before addressing everyone. "Mr. Caldwell has exercised his legal right to observe today's proceedings." Richard smiled warmly. "Only because I deeply respect the remarkable work this foundation has accomplished." He slowly opened his briefcase and removed several neatly organized folders. "Unfortunately, charitable organizations often struggle to remain financially sustainable. My company specializes in preserving valuable properties through responsible redevelopment." The words sounded generous until I remembered the photographs lying open on the table beside us. Community health centers, scholarship programs, historic libraries, neighborhood outreach projects. They were never described as valuable real estate until this moment. Richard carefully spread several architectural renderings across the polished wood. Elegant hotels replaced community buildings. Luxury residences stood where public gardens once appeared. Boutique shopping districts covered areas that had once hosted youth education centers. Every drawing looked beautiful. Every drawing erased the people who actually used those places. "These projects would generate substantial economic growth," Richard explained. "Jobs, tourism, tax revenue, and significant investment." One elderly trustee quietly shook her head. "And where would the families receiving scholarships go?" Richard maintained his polite smile. "Alternative funding could certainly be explored." His answer sounded practiced rather than personal. I looked toward Nathan, expecting him to argue. Instead, he slowly opened another leather folder resting beside the original Foundation documents. Inside were handwritten annual reports dating back almost 4 decades. He carefully slid one across the table toward Richard. "Please read page 12, Nathan said calmly. Richard glanced down briefly before reading silently. The pleasant expression on his face faded almost immediately. Nathan spoke softly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. "Every building protected by this foundation is legally connected to a permanent charitable covenant established before your company existed." Richard closed the report without responding. Nathan continued. "Redevelopment may increase property values. It cannot legally erase community obligations attached to those properties." Silence settled across the chapel once again. The elderly attorney beside me slowly nodded. "Mr. Sullivan is correct." Richard remained composed, although his smile had become noticeably smaller. "There is still one condition that remains unresolved," he replied. "Without both signatures, the transfer clause activates automatically at 5 o'clock. Nathan looked toward me instead of answering him. His calm blue eyes carried no pressure. No expectation. Only patience. He reached into his jacket pocket and quietly placed 2 fountain pens beside the signature lines. Then, without saying another word, he removed a folded document from the final folder and placed it directly beside the marriage agreement. I looked down and immediately recognized the title printed across the first page. Voluntary Cancellation of Marriage Ceremony. Nathan had already signed it before walking into the chapel. "Whatever happens next," he said gently, "your freedom will never depend on my decision. It has always depended on yours." My eyes remained fixed on the two documents lying side by side. One would complete the marriage ceremony. The other would end it before it ever began. Nathan had already signed the cancellation form, leaving only my signature blank. I looked at him in disbelief. "You prepared this before today?" I asked quietly. He nodded. The moment I learned the entire truth, his answer settled over the room like the last note of a familiar song. The trustees remained silent. Even Richard Caldwell stopped arranging the papers inside his briefcase. Everyone seemed to understand that no attorney, contract, or deadline mattered until I decided what happened next. I slowly reached for the cancellation document, running my fingertips across the smooth paper without lifting the pen. It would have been the easiest decision in the world only 1 hour earlier. I had come to the estate convinced I needed to escape. Now, for the first time since arriving, I realized no one had ever locked the door. An elderly woman seated in the front pew quietly stood and walked toward the walnut table. Her silver hair framed a kind face that carried the quiet confidence of someone who had witnessed many difficult seasons. She placed another weathered leather journal beside me before returning to her seat without saying a word. Curious, I opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten entries from my father and Nathan's grandfather recorded over nearly 20 years. They did not write about wealth or business victories. They wrote about families whose homes had been rebuilt after natural disasters, students who became doctors because of scholarship programs, and small community libraries that remained open because someone quietly chose generosity over profit. One page stopped me completely. My father had written, "If our children ever stand where we once stood, I hope they inherit the freedom to choose compassion before convenience." Tears filled my eyes again. Nathan gently slid a folded envelope toward me. "There is one more document you have not seen." I carefully opened it. Inside rested a notarized letter signed by Nathan only 3 days earlier. It stated that if I declined the marriage, he would personally transfer every private asset necessary to keep the charitable foundation operating until another lawful solution could be established. My hands trembled as I finished reading. "You were willing to lose everything?" I whispered. Nathan smiled gently. "Money can be earned again." He looked toward the stained glass windows where warm sunlight continued to fill the chapel. "The mission they built cannot." Richard Caldwell quietly cleared his throat. "That level of financial support is substantial." Nathan simply nodded. "It is enough." No one spoke for several long moments. The chapel clock ticked softly against the far wall while dust drifted through beams of afternoon light. I realized something remarkable. Nathan had removed every possible reason for me to feel trapped. If I signed the cancellation, the foundation would survive because of his sacrifice. If I signed the marriage agreement, the foundation would survive because we chose to protect it together. For the first time, either document represented fear. They represented two different paths built upon the same act of kindness. I slowly looked around the chapel. The trustees watched quietly. The attorneys waited patiently. Richard Caldwell remained standing beside his briefcase, no longer appearing nearly as confident as before. Finally, my eyes returned to Nathan. He had not moved. He had not urged me toward either document. He simply waited with calm acceptance, prepared to honor whichever decision I made. I reached for one of the fountain pens, took a slow breath, and before the ink touched either page, I quietly asked the one question that suddenly mattered more than every legal agreement resting on the table. "Nathan, if there had never been a foundation, would you still have opened that door for me today?" The question lingered in the quiet chapel long after I finished speaking. No one reached for the documents. No one interrupted the silence. Even the steady ticking of the antique clock seemed softer, as though the room itself was waiting for Nathan's answer. He looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn since opening the bridal suite door. There was no hesitation in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "I would have opened it every single time." I searched his face for uncertainty, but found none. Why? I whispered. He lowered his gaze for only a moment before answering. Because no promise has value if it is built on someone else's fear. His words settled deep inside me. Everything I had believed about him over the past several weeks slowly gave way to something entirely different. I had expected control. Instead, I found restraint. I had expected demands. Instead, I found respect. The elderly trustees exchanged quiet smiles that carried years of understanding. One of them carefully closed the oldest leather ledger before speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. Your grandfather often repeated the same lesson, she said warmly. He believed that people reveal their true character when they are willing to lose something important rather than force another person to stay. Nathan smiled faintly without looking away from me. Richard Caldwell quietly adjusted his tie before speaking again. This is certainly admirable, he said in an even voice. However, admiration does not change contractual deadlines. He glanced toward the antique clock mounted above the chapel entrance. Less than 30 minutes remain. The reminder echoed through the room without creating panic. I realized that everyone present had spent decades protecting something much greater than buildings or financial records. They were protecting trust itself. I slowly stood from my chair and walked toward the stained glass windows overlooking the lake. Outside, autumn leaves drifted gently across the estate grounds while sunlight shimmered across the calm water beyond. The east gate remained visible in the distance. Nathan's car was still waiting exactly where he had promised. The path to leave had never disappeared. I could walk away at any moment. No one would stop me. That realization changed everything. Freedom does not become meaningful when someone gives it to you. It becomes meaningful when someone refuses to take it away. I turned back toward the walnut table. Nathan remained seated exactly where I had left him. The two fountain pens still rested between the marriage agreement and the cancellation document. Neither paper had moved. Neither choice had been taken from me. I slowly returned to my chair and picked up the platinum wedding band resting inside the velvet box. The simple engraving caught the afternoon light once more. Choose freely. Always. My father had trusted this promise. Nathan's grandfather had protected it. Nathan had honored it. Now the decision belonged entirely to me. I carefully slipped the ring back into its place before looking around the chapel. Every face reflected patience instead of expectation. The attorneys waited quietly. The trustees remained composed. Even Richard Caldwell stood without speaking, fully aware that no legal strategy could influence a decision that had become deeply personal. I reached for the marriage agreement, then paused before touching the paper. Instead of signing immediately, I looked toward the elderly attorney. Before I make my decision, I said softly, I would like everyone in this room to hear the final letter my father left behind. The attorney slowly opened the last sealed envelope resting beside the foundation ledger, unfolded the carefully preserved pages, and after taking a measured breath, began reading the first sentence aloud. As his voice filled the chapel, I realized the final answer had been waiting inside that letter for 20 years. The elderly attorney unfolded the final letter with extraordinary care, as though every crease protected a memory too valuable to lose. The chapel grew so quiet that I could hear the gentle crackle of candlelight beside the stained glass windows. Afternoon sunlight stretched farther across the marble floor, reminding everyone that time continued moving whether we were ready or not. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading. To our children, if this letter ever reaches your hands, then life has already become more complicated than we hoped. You may inherit responsibilities that you never requested, but you must never inherit obligations that silence your own heart. If preserving this foundation ever requires sacrificing another person's freedom, then let the foundation end before compassion does. Every word echoed through the chapel with quiet certainty. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, hearing my father's voice between the lines even though he had been gone for years. The attorney continued. This mission was never created to bind two people together. It was created to keep neighbors together. Buildings can be rebuilt. Wealth can be earned again. Trust, once broken, is the most difficult thing to restore. I looked toward Nathan. He had already heard these words before today, yet his expression remained unchanged. There was no pride in his face, only gratitude that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Richard Caldwell lowered his eyes to the polished floor. For the first time since entering the chapel, he said nothing. The final page of the letter contained only one short sentence written beneath both founders' signatures. Choose kindness before convenience, even when kindness costs more. The attorney carefully folded the letter and placed it beside the original foundation ledger. Silence filled the room once again, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt peaceful. I slowly reached toward the two documents resting before me. My fingertips brushed the cancellation form first. Nathan watched quietly without moving. Then my hand crossed toward the marriage agreement. I looked directly into his eyes. If I sign this, I said softly, it will not be because anyone expected me to. He nodded once. I know. I smiled for the first time that afternoon. It will be because I finally understand what both of our families were trying to protect. Nathan's expression softened with quiet relief. I picked up the fountain pen, read every line of the agreement one final time, and carefully signed my name beneath his. The ink dried almost instantly across the heavy paper. No applause followed. No dramatic celebration interrupted the moment. Instead, the elderly trustees quietly stood together. Several of them wiped away tears before offering gentle smiles that carried decades of gratitude. The attorney signed the final certification while another trustee carefully placed the completed agreement inside a protective archival folder. Richard Caldwell slowly closed his briefcase. He offered a respectful nod toward Nathan before turning to me. Miss Brooks, he said calmly, although my proposal has ended today, I sincerely hope the Foundation continues serving this community for many years. There was disappointment in his voice, but no bitterness. Nathan stepped forward only after every document had been secured. He did not reach for my hand. He simply extended the small velvet ring box toward me once more. There is still one choice left, he said quietly. The agreement is complete, but the ring is entirely separate. You never have to wear it unless one day it truly means something to you. I looked at the simple platinum band resting inside the velvet lining, then gently closed the lid without taking it. Not today, I whispered with a warm smile. Some promises deserve time before they become forever. Nathan smiled back, and together we turned toward the open chapel doors where the late afternoon sunlight waited, brighter than it had seemed when I first believed I needed to escape. 6 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined they would. The headlines disappeared within days because there had never been a dramatic wedding to celebrate. The Foundation continued its work without seeking attention, and somehow that felt perfectly fitting. Every Wednesday morning I drove through the familiar stone gates of the estate carrying a notebook instead of uncertainty. The grand house no longer felt intimidating. Sunlight poured through the same tall windows that had once watched me search for an escape, yet now every room felt lighter because nothing inside demanded that I remain. The bridal suite had become a reading room where scholarship applicants gathered every month. The chapel hosted community meetings, student award ceremonies, and volunteer appreciation events. The walnut table where 2 documents had changed my life remained exactly where it had always been, although it was now covered with children's artwork, foundation plans, and handwritten thank you letters from families whose lives continued to improve because someone long ago believed kindness deserved legal protection. Nathan and I worked side by side almost every day. We reviewed grant applications together, visited neighborhood health centers, and listened to teachers describe new educational programs funded by the Foundation. We learned each other's habits without rushing to define anything beyond friendship and trust. Some afternoons we shared coffee beside the lake in comfortable silence. Other days we spent hours debating which projects deserved priority. Every conversation reminded me that respect grows strongest when neither person tries to control the other. One crisp autumn afternoon I found Nathan standing outside the chapel entrance watching volunteers plant young maple trees along the walkway. Bright red and golden leaves drifted gently through the cool breeze. He smiled as children laughed while carrying small watering cans almost larger than they were. Your father would have loved this, he said quietly. I smiled back. So would your grandfather. We stood together without speaking for several moments before he reached into his jacket pocket. My heart skipped when I recognized the familiar velvet ring box. He noticed my expression and laughed softly. Do not worry, he said. I promise you that every choice would always remain yours. He placed the unopened box into my hands without asking me to open it. Keep it, he continued. Whether you wear the ring next year, 10 years from now, or never at all, nothing changes what we built together. I looked down at the small box before slipping it carefully into my coat pocket. This time I did not feel pressure. I felt peace. As evening settled across the estate, we walked toward the front entrance together. The same wooden door that had once represented fear remained wide open, welcoming neighbors arriving for another community gathering. I paused on the threshold and looked back through the hallway where my journey had truly begun. Nathan waited several feet away, just as he had on that first afternoon, leaving enough space for me to choose my own direction. I smiled and walked toward him without hesitation. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I finally understood the difference between being held and being welcomed. Some people believe love begins with a promise. I learned that lasting love begins with freedom. And sometimes the most unforgettable door is not the one someone closes behind you. It is the one they quietly leave open until you decide to walk through it on your own.